Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling something I know a lot of you are worried about. That's your shrinking buying power. And we've got a really interesting source that brings this issue to life. It's a video blog from a blue-collar worker who's been reflecting on all the economic changes over the past 5 years. He really lays it all out there. Just how much harder it's become to afford even the basics.
Yeah.
He uses some really vivid examples from his own life,
Okay.
like how his rent has absolutely skyrocketed, and grocery shopping. It feels like a luxury now.
Yeah.
Filling up his gas tank, a constant drain. Oh, and get this. His old rental,
Oh.
a three-bedroom place,
Hmm.
it went for $1,300 just 5 years ago. Now, listed at $3,100.
Wow.
That's a 138% increase.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And with the election just around the corner, he's pretty skeptical.
Yeah, I bet.
He's not sure any of the candidates really understand what it's like for everyday folks like him. So what's behind all these changes? Is it just his personal experience, or is there something bigger going on? Let's break it all down.
Well, what's really interesting is that this vlogger's story, it's not unique at all. It actually reflects a much larger trend of rising inflation that's been hitting the whole country.
Right.
You think about it, everything's gotten more expensive. Housing, food, energy costs, they've all been steadily going up. And it's really hitting lower and middle income households the hardest.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones who have to spend a bigger chunk of their income on these basic necessities. So when prices shoot up, they've got less wiggle room in their budgets.
Exactly. And the vlogger really drives that point home with his personal story.
Mm-hmm.
He's 54, working hard, but still feeling that squeeze, that feeling of running on a treadmill and going nowhere.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
He's starting to lose faith in the American dream. Saving for retirement. Impossible. Dealing with an unexpected expense. Forget about it.
Right.
Not when you're living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
It really resonates with me, that anxiety about the future. What are we supposed to do when the cost of just existing keeps going up?
Well, this disillusionment with the American dream, it's something we're seeing across society. And it points to this growing gap between what people aspire to and what feels achievable in our economy today.
Right. So let's dig into some of those specific examples he gave, like his old three-bedroom rental, the one that went from $1,300 to $3,100 in just 5 years. I mean, that is a mind-blowing increase.
It is.
What on earth is driving rent prices up so dramatically?
Well, there are a few things at play, but one factor that often gets overlooked is the role of real estate investment.
Oh, interesting.
We've seen this huge surge in investors buying up properties, not to live in themselves, but to rent out at these inflated prices. This creates competition for the available housing, which drives up prices. And that makes it even tougher for people like the vlogger to find an affordable place to live.
So it's not just about supply and demand, it's also about who's controlling that supply and how they're using it. That adds a whole other layer to this issue, doesn't it?
Exactly. And it really highlights the need to think about policies that create a fairer housing market, one that puts the needs of residents ahead of the profits of investors.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
He also talked about the pain at the pump and at the grocery store,
Of course.
how those everyday costs are really adding up. And I think we've all been feeling that pinch lately.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little insight into what's happening with inflation,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to those essentials?
Absolutely. Globally, we've been dealing with all these supply chain disruptions
Right.
caused by things like the pandemic and geopolitical instability. And this has led to higher costs for transportation, for raw materials, for production. Ultimately, that leads to higher prices for everything.
You're like a ripple effect. One disruption leads to another, and then it all hits us in our wallets when we buy those necessities.
Exactly. And remember, when it comes to food and fuel, those price increases hit lower income households the hardest because these essentials make up a bigger part of their budget. So it's like a double whammy. Costs are rising and their wages just aren't keeping up.
You can really hear the frustration in his voice when he talks about working so hard but still falling behind. He emphasizes it's not just about finding any job. It's about job quality, stability, decent wages, benefits, all those things that give you some peace of mind. It's like he's saying, don't just give me a job, give me a chance to build a life.
He is absolutely right. The nature of work is changing. And for a lot of blue-collar workers, that means facing some serious challenges.
Yeah?
We've seen a decline in unions, which traditionally fought for better wages and benefits. And the rise of gig work, while it offers flexibility, often lacks the stability and benefits of traditional employment.
It's like a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
You might have more freedom but less security. And with the cost of living going up, that lack of security is terrifying.
Exactly. It raises these really important questions about how we value different kinds of work and how we make sure that all workers have access to a decent standard of living.
That's a big one.
It's interesting, he brought up a couple of ideas that he thinks could really help working people like him.
Oh, yeah.
He talked about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, and no tax on Social Security.
Yeah, he seemed pretty passionate about those ideas, especially the one about overtime. He mentioned working a lot of overtime. So I can see how that would make a real difference for him. But is that actually realistic? I mean, could that actually happen? And what about those other ideas? Are those just campaign promises?
Well, those are the kinds of proposals that get brought up a lot as ways to put more money in the pockets of working class Americans.
Okay, I see. Less taxes, more take-home pay. It sounds pretty simple, right?
Right, but like most policy proposals, there are always trade-offs.
Yeah. What kind of trade-offs?
Well, for instance, if you eliminate taxes on certain types of income, that reduces the government's revenue, which can impact funding for things like social programs, infrastructure, other essential services.
So it's like a balancing act. You want to help people keep more of their hard-earned money, but you also need to make sure the government can still function and provide those services we all rely on.
Exactly. And of course, different political perspectives will weigh those priorities differently.
Right.
Some might say tax cuts stimulate economic growth, leading to more jobs, higher wages in the long run. Others might put more emphasis on government-funded social safety nets and public investments to support those who are struggling.
It's really interesting how these policy debates, they reflect different values and visions for our whole society.
Absolutely.
It's not just about the numbers, it's about what we believe is important.
It really is.
Okay, so we've talked about these tax-related proposals, but what about other things policymakers could consider? What else is on the table that could actually move the needle on these issues?
Well, one area that often comes up is the lack of affordable housing, something our vlogger is very familiar with.
Yeah, for sure.
Remember that crazy rent increase on his old house?
Oh, yeah,
That's a huge problem for a lot of people.
absolutely. It feels impossible to find an affordable place to live these days.
Right.
So what can we do about it?
Well, policymakers could try a few different things. They could create incentives for building more affordable housing,
Okay.
provide rental assistance to lower-income families, or enact policies that prevent predatory lending practices, the kind of things that can trap people in a cycle of debt.
I see. Those sound promising. But what about wages? The vlogger talked about feeling like his paycheck just can't keep up with how much everything costs.
Right.
Is there anything we can do to address that wage stagnation?
That's where things get pretty heated.
Uh-oh.
Some argue that raising the minimum wage is essential, that it would really help those low-wage workers who are struggling the most.
Okay.
But others worry that it could lead to job losses. If businesses can't handle the increased labor costs, it's a tough issue. Strong arguments on both sides.
So is there any kind of middle ground? A solution that could help workers without hurting businesses?
Well, some folks think strengthening worker bargaining power is the answer. Things like supporting unions or promoting worker cooperatives. The idea is that when workers have a stronger collective voice, they're better able to negotiate for better wages and benefits.
So it's not just about setting a minimum wage. It's about giving workers more leverage to improve their own situation.
Exactly, giving them a real say in their economic fate.
That makes sense. You know, something else the vlogger talked about that really stuck with me was this idea of job quality. He wants a job that offers stability, benefits, opportunities for growth. How can policy address those kinds of concerns? Because it seems like those are the things that can make or break someone's future.
That's a major challenge in this ever-changing job market. One approach is to expand access to affordable healthcare, childcare, and education.
Okay.
That can give workers a greater sense of security and stability. It's about removing those barriers that hold people back.
I can see how that would be huge, especially for families who are already struggling. If you're always worried about medical bills or finding childcare, it's hard to focus on anything else, let alone plan for the future.
Exactly. And another approach is investing in workforce development programs, providing training, helping people upgrade their skills so they can adapt to those changing job demands.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. Provide support to help people stabilize their lives.
Yeah.
And then give them the tools they need to thrive in the future.
Right. And remember, this isn't just about helping individuals. It's about Recognizing that a strong economy depends on a well-educated and skilled workforce. It benefits us all in the long run.
All of this is giving me a lot to think about. It seems like there's so many different things we could be doing, and they all have pros and cons.
That's the reality, and that's why it's so important to keep having these conversations, to consider those different viewpoints.
Yeah.
There's no magic bullet,
Right.
but by really digging into the complexities, understanding the trade-offs, we can start working towards policies that create a better future for everyone.
It's a good reminder that this isn't just about abstract economic ideas. This is about real people's lives, their struggles, their hopes.
Exactly. And this vlogger's story shows us how these economic trends are playing out for everyday people.
Yeah, it really does. Makes me wonder what he thinks about all these potential solutions. What speaks to him? What are his priorities?
That's a great question. And it's something to keep in mind as we move forward. Ultimately, policy decisions should be shaped by the voices and experiences of those most affected.
Okay, so we've discussed potential policy solutions, but I'm curious about the vlogger's concerns about the election. He didn't seem too optimistic, like he didn't think politicians would actually follow through on their promises. And I think a lot of people feel that way. It's like, here we go again, more empty promises.
I understand that skepticism. There's definitely a history of political rhetoric not translating into real change for working class Americans.
Right. But what about this election in particular? Are there any reasons to be hopeful, or are we just going to end up disappointed again?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it depends who you ask. But it feels like the stakes are really high this time, especially for folks like the vlogger who are already feeling the pressure.
Yeah, you're right. A lot is writing on this. So let's look at some of the specific concerns he raised about the candidates and their platforms. He felt like some of the things they're talking about wouldn't really help him or people in similar situations.
Yeah, like what?
Well, he specifically mentioned the proposals for a $25,000 tax credit for down payments on homes and the $6,000 tax credit for first-time parents.
Right.
He was basically like, what about those of us who are never going to be able to afford a house? Or those of us who already have kids, where's the help for us?
That's a really good point.
It is. Targeted policies can be helpful for certain groups, but they sometimes miss the mark when it comes to addressing these bigger economic anxieties.
It's like he's feeling invisible, like his struggles don't matter to the people in charge. And that feeling of being left behind, it can be so demoralizing.
Absolutely. That feeling is a big part of why we're seeing so much disillusionment and frustration among blue-collar workers. It's like they're saying, we're here, we're working hard, but nobody's listening.
So how do we change that?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that the people who need help the most, the people who feel like their voices aren't being heard, how do we make sure their needs are addressed?
Well, it's all about amplifying those voices, the voices of people who are often overlooked in these political debates. We need to create opportunities for real dialogue where people can share their experiences and feel like they're being heard. We need to make sure everyone has a seat at the table when decisions are being made.
It's like what we're doing here, right? Taking a deep dive into one man's story and using it to understand the bigger picture, connecting those personal struggles to these wider systemic issues.
Precisely. By connecting those individual stories to the bigger economic trends and policy discussions, we can start to build a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of what our communities are facing.
This has been incredibly insightful, but I have to admit, it also feels a bit overwhelming. Where do we even begin to tackle these complex issues? It's easy to get stuck, to feel paralyzed by how big this all is.
That's where it becomes crucial to empower people to take action in their own communities.
Okay.
Whether it's getting involved in local politics,
Right.
supporting organizations that are fighting for working families, or even just having honest conversations with friends and family about these issues, we can all play a role in creating a more just and equitable society.
So while the challenges are huge and complicated, there's still hope that we can work together to find solutions.
Absolutely. Recognizing the problem and acknowledging the many different experiences and perspectives in our communities, that's the first step.
Okay.
From there, we can start building a shared vision for the future and work together to make it happen. It's about remembering that we're in this together.
It's amazing how we started with this one guy's story,
Yeah.
About his buying power shrinking and the struggles of making ends meet. And look where we are now,
Yeah.
talking about these massive problems facing our entire country.
It really is something else. These individual stories that can be so powerful, they help us see the real human impact of all those economic trends we hear so much about.
Yeah, for sure. That's why I think it's been so important to keep circling back to this vlogger's perspective. because we can get lost in those policy debates and forget about the real people going through these struggles.
I agree. Policy decisions can't happen in a vacuum. They have to be grounded in the experiences of the people they're meant to help.
Exactly. Something you touched on earlier that I wanted to dive into a bit more is the role of communities in tackling these economic challenges. We've talked about individual choices and government action, but what about that space in between? What about the power of communities?
Oh, that's absolutely critical. You see, strong communities can provide these vital support systems and create opportunities that might not exist otherwise. It's all about people coming together to help one another.
I like that. But what does that actually look like in practice? How can communities make a tangible difference for people who are really struggling financially?
Well, think of it this way. Communities are these networks made up of individuals, organizations, institutions,
Okay,
and each one has a role to play.
gotcha.
Take local businesses, for example. They can be incredible forces for good.
How so?
They can pay fair wages,
Right.
offer job training, even support local initiatives that address community needs.
Right.
And then there are nonprofits, those unsung heroes, providing food assistance, affordable housing, financial literacy programs.
Yeah, those are so important.
They're working right there on the front lines.
Makes you think about all the different ways people can step up and help. But what about our individual roles within those communities? What can we do as individuals to be good neighbors and help build a more equitable society?
Sometimes it's the small things that have the biggest impact, like volunteering at a food bank, mentoring a young person, or just checking in on an elderly neighbor who might be having a tough time.
I love that.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, that we have this shared humanity.
It's about realizing we're not in this alone.
Right. When people feel connected to their community, when they feel supported, they're more likely to thrive.
And then give back to that community. It's a cycle.
Exactly, a virtuous cycle.
This is all very inspiring. But we have to be realistic too. Building strong communities isn't always easy. There are challenges, sometimes systemic barriers and inequalities.
You're right, we can't ignore those realities. We have to be mindful of those historical injustices and power imbalances that can divide us.
So it's about more than just being kind to one another. It's also about fighting for a system that works for everyone.
Absolutely. True equity requires systemic change.
This has been a really incredible journey. We started by talking about one man's struggle to make ends meet and ended up exploring these huge issues that affect all of us.
It's true. And along the way, I think we've learned a lot about the power of individual stories, about the importance of community, and about the need for all of us to be part of the solution.
I totally agree. Well, that wraps up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.